She was the glowing face of country music, a Grammy-winning matriarch admired by millions. But when Naomi Judd took her own life just one day before the biggest honor of her career, the world stopped. And then came the autopsy, scars, powerful medications, and a handwritten note reportedly aimed at her own daughter. What was Naomi Judd hiding? And what disturbing truths did her final moments reveal that her fans never saw coming? For over a decade, Naomi Judd stood as the radiant symbol of family, femininity, and fierce musical talent in American country music. But behind the iconic red hair and heartfelt harmonies was a woman who had built her career not out of privilege, but out of grit. Born Diana Ellen Judd in 1946, she was a single mother working as a nurse in Nashville before she ever held a microphone. It wasn't until she began singing with her daughter Wynonna that the world took notice. Their voices fused into something electric, raw, vulnerable, and unforgettable. The Judds weren't just a duo, they were a movement. In an era dominated by male voices, their mother-daughter bond became a cultural beacon. Chart-topping hits like Why Not Me, Grandpa, Tell Me About the Good Old Days, and Mama He's Crazy cemented them as legends. But while the spotlight adored Naomi, her private world was far less stable. Fame brought pressure, scrutiny, and a demand for perfection that never let up. Naomi's smile was iconic, but as we'd later learn, it was often a mask, a way to conceal the unraveling pain that fame couldn't cure. While the world saw Naomi Judd as a glowing icon of resilience, those closest to her knew a far more fragile reality. Naomi didn't just face depression, she lived with it like a shadow, one that stretched across decades and darkened even her brightest moments. Diagnosed with bipolar disorder and long-term anxiety, Naomi was one of the few country stars of her generation who spoke openly about mental illness. She gave speeches, wrote books, and became an advocate for mental health awareness. But public advocacy isn't the same as personal healing. Behind closed doors, Naomi was often overwhelmed by fame, by trauma, and by a lifelong internal war that medication alone couldn't win. Even after retiring from music in 1991, due to a hepatitis C diagnosis, her emotional struggles didn't fade. Doctors once gave her just 3 years to live, but she beat the odds and turned her pain into a mission. Still, the weight never lifted. As the years passed, family tension, chronic illness, and lingering guilt only deepened her emotional burden. And in 2022, when Naomi and Wynonna announced a farewell tour, it was supposed to be a celebration. But for Naomi, it may have felt more like a final performance, a terrifying return to the spotlight that exposed every wound she had worked so hard to hide. On the morning of April 30th, 2022, just one day before she was set to be inducted into the Country Music Hall of Fame, alongside her daughter Wynonna, Naomi Judd's world came to a devastating end. At precisely 10:57 a.m., family members discovered her inside her Tennessee home. Emergency responders were called immediately. She was still alive when they arrived, but barely. Naomi was rushed to Williamson Medical Center, where she was pronounced dead at 12:35 p.m. The news stunned not only her fans, but the entire music industry. And then came the report, the autopsy that didn't just confirm suicide, but opened a door to details that many were not prepared to confront. The wound had entered from the right side of her scalp, traveled through multiple regions of the brain that govern emotion and decision-making, and exited on the opposite side of the crown. It was a self-inflicted act, intentional, planned, and final. But what truly shocked investigators wasn't just the clinical evidence. Found near Naomi's body was a handwritten note. Though the full contents were never officially released, multiple sources reported that it included emotionally charged language, and even blame, aimed directly at her daughter Wynonna. In the hours leading up to one of the greatest honors of her life, Naomi Judd had reached a breaking point and left behind not just a body, but a deeply personal message that continues to haunt those she left behind. When the full autopsy report was released, it didn't just confirm Naomi Judd's cause of death, it unveiled a series of deeply unsettling truths. Beneath the surface of a glamorous public figure lay the physical evidence of a woman who had been waging war with herself for years. The report detailed multiple surgical scars across her scalp, eyes, abdomen, and knees, signs of cosmetic procedures that hinted at an effort to maintain a public image, even as her health was deteriorating. Tattoos along her lips and hairline suggested a meticulous attempt to control how she appeared in front of the camera. But it was the toxicology findings that painted the most disturbing picture. Naomi's body contained a potent mix of prescription medications, venlafaxine, trazodone, primidone, memantine, and a psychoactive agent known as MCPP. These aren't recreational drugs. They're powerful psychiatric and neurological medications prescribed for depression, insomnia, bipolar disorder, seizure prevention, and even memory-related disorders like Alzheimer's. The combination of these substances is risky on its own, but in Naomi's case, it may have pushed her emotional state past the point of return. According to experts, the interaction of these drugs can cause confusion, sedation, disorientation, and emotional volatility. In other words, Naomi may have been experiencing a profound psychological crisis in her final days. But perhaps the most haunting discovery was the note left behind, reportedly addressed to Wynonna. Though the contents remain sealed, sources close to the investigation say it expressed blame, grief, and emotional anguish. It was a final cry from a woman who had given the world everything and still felt alone. To the outside world, Naomi and Wynonna Judd were the embodiment of strength. Two women standing side by side, conquering the country music scene with heart, harmony, and charisma. But offstage, their relationship was far from harmonious. It was a bond forged in hardship and tested by fame, a connection filled with love, resentment, and long silences. Naomi once described Wynonna as both her greatest joy and her greatest challenge. Touring, recording, and living under the same spotlight blurred the lines between mother and daughter, turning what should have been a familial bond into a high-pressure partnership. Behind their glittering duets were years of emotional blow-ups and prolonged estrangements. Both women spoke openly, at times tearfully, about the volatility that haunted their connection. And yet, through every storm, they returned to each other until the end. Naomi's final days were marked not by a public rift, but by a quiet distance. The farewell tour they had planned together was supposed to bring them full circle, a healing moment in the public eye. But behind the scenes, Wynonna has since admitted they weren't speaking regularly. The note Naomi reportedly left behind, aimed at her daughter, wasn't just a private message. It was a final fracture. Wynonna has spoken openly about the emotional aftermath, calling it survivor's guilt, a weight she now carries every day. She wasn't just left without a mother. She was left with unresolved questions, unspoken words, and a legacy of love that feels more like a puzzle than a memory. For Wynonna, honoring her mother now means performing the songs they once sang together, while wondering if the silence between them ever could have been broken. While Naomi Judd's death shattered Wynonna, it also exposed a quieter fracture within the Judd family, one that had gone mostly unnoticed. The emotional divide between Wynonna and her younger sister, Ashley Judd. Both daughters lived through the chaos of their mother's mental illness and fame, yet their paths and their pain took them in very different directions. Ashley, the acclaimed Hollywood actress and humanitarian, once described their childhood home as unstable, filled with emotional landmines and long stretches of solitude. Wynonna, on the other hand, was swept away by fame early, leaving at 18 to tour full-time with Naomi. While Ashley stayed behind to navigate the emotional wreckage, Wynonna became the face of the family legacy. That imbalance left a mark. Ashley referred to Wynonna as her sister mommy, a nickname that made Wynonna visibly uncomfortable. The burden of being both a sibling and a surrogate parent was never something she asked for. Over the years, that tension calcified into distance. Today, the two sisters live on the same sprawling Tennessee property, but they rarely speak. There is no scandal, no dramatic falling out, just a history too heavy to unpack. After Naomi's death, the emotional contrast between them became clear. Ashley's public statements were poised and polished, focused on destigmatizing mental illness. Wynonna's, in contrast, were raw and fragmented, revealing a daughter still reeling from a loss she couldn't fully understand. And through it all, one truth remained. The Judd family was united by blood, but divided by silence. The kind of silence that doesn't shout, but lingers. In every missed call, every avoided visit, and every moment of grief that feels too personal to share. After losing her mother to suicide and watching her family unravel under the weight of silence, Wynonna Judd faced yet another heartbreak, this time behind closed doors. Not long after Naomi's death, Wynonna's husband, Cactus Moser, suffered a sudden medical event that left him unable to use the entire left side of his body. The man who had once played drums beside her on stage was now confined to their home, dependent on her for daily care. In a matter of weeks, Wynonna went from grieving daughter to full-time caregiver. She didn't speak about it immediately. When she did, it was with striking vulnerability. Their house had to be retrofitted with ramps and grips. Medical equipment replaced instruments. And in one unforgettable moment, Wynonna described standing in the shower, physically holding her husband upright so he wouldn't fall. "We were supposed to do this at 8:0, she said softly. "Not now." It wasn't said with anger, but with mourning for a future that had been stolen. Publicly, she finished the farewell tour she and Naomi had planned. She stood on stage, smiled, sang, and gave interviews. Privately, she was lifting her husband out of bed, coordinating therapies and managing medications. Life had turned from glitter to grit. But what stunned even doctors was Cactus's will to recover. Months later, he was seen skiing on one leg, refusing to surrender to the diagnosis. That same spirit, quiet and relentless, defines Wynonna too. This wasn't about applause anymore. It was about showing up every day, even when the curtain fell. And no one was watching. Naomi Judd's death wasn't just a personal tragedy. It was a public reckoning, a stark reminder that even the brightest stars can be battling the darkest demons. For decades, she had been celebrated as a survivor, a trailblazer, a fierce mother who rose from single parenthood to country music royalty. But what her autopsy exposed was far more than just clinical data. It revealed the crushing emotional weight that fame can mask. The perfectly applied makeup, the cosmetic procedures, the carefully chosen words in interviews, all part of a fragile facade held together by pills, pressure, and pain. Her death wasn't a scandal. It was a symptom of something so many endure in silence, the impossibility of living up to public expectations while quietly breaking down inside. And the handwritten note she reportedly left, possibly blaming her own daughter, showed the cost of unresolved family trauma, how decades of love and friction can culminate in words too heavy to carry. But perhaps the most haunting question is this: did Naomi Judd have to die? Could a different system of support, earlier intervention, or a more compassionate understanding have changed the outcome? It's a question that echoes far beyond the Judd family. Because this wasn't just a loss for music, it was a warning about the price of silence, the limits of image, and the urgent need to talk about mental illness, not just in headlines, but in homes. And for those still searching for closure in Naomi's final days, it may never come in the form of answers, only in the willingness to tell the truth. She never could. Naomi Judd gave the world music that healed, inspired, and united generations. But in the end, her own wounds were the ones left untreated. Her story isn't just about fame or family or the heartbreaking end of a life. It's about what we don't see behind the applause. It's about the silence that lingers long after the music stops. And maybe, just maybe, her final act wasn't just a tragedy, but a mirror, a chance for all of us to ask, who around us is suffering in silence? Who is smiling while breaking inside? If Naomi's legacy teaches us anything, it's that mental illness doesn't discriminate. It can live behind stage lights, inside boardrooms, or next door, and we have to stop pretending it's invisible. So let this story be more than a headline. Share it. Talk about it. Use it to check in on someone you love, because sometimes the most powerful thing we can do is listen. If this video moved you, please like, comment, and subscribe. And if you're struggling or know someone who is, don't wait. Reach out. You're not alone. Click on the next video on your screen to uncover another powerful untold story. Until next time, this is Good Old Days, signing off.